welcome to chapter 2 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. So hopefully you've got the copy of the chapter alongside you so that you can read along as I am going through the chapter. As I've done before, I will be stopping and pausing at key moments. This is a slightly longer chapter than the last one, but hopefully we've got a little bit of an idea of some of the context, a little bit of the background, so it will make it a little bit more straightforward with some of the things that I'm talking about. So the first thing then that's important is the title of the chapter, as always. There are 10 chapters in total. This is chapter 2, and it's called The Search for Mr Hyde. Significant in several ways. First of all, because we have the word search, which suggests that this is becoming a bit like a manhunt now. We've already talked about in the previous chapter the way that Utterson is sort of like he's our detective in the novel. He is kind of the eyes and ears of the reader, and he's the person that starts putting together the story. And if you recall, at the end of the previous chapter, Mr Utterson, Gabriel Utterson, the lawyer, was out for a walk with his cousin, Mr Enfield, Richard Enfield, and Enfield told Utterson, his cousin, a story that he was reminded of when they walked past the door, hence the title of the first chapter, The Story of the Door. And if you recall, it's the story of a gentleman called Mr Hyde, who he saw run into a little girl at the corner of a by street, knocked her over accidentally, but then that wasn't the issue. It was the fact that he then carried on running and trampled straight over her. He didn't stop to help her. He didn't try and make amends for what he'd done. He didn't apologise. And it was only because he stopped by Enfield and some other passers-by that the man was apprehended. And if you recall, he was kind of pushed to compensate the little girl and her family for the incident, and went into the door and came out with a small sum of money and also a cheque for quite a significant amount. And we don't quite know yet who signed that cheque, but it was actually Dr. Jekyll, we find out. And so we've started to get this concern from Mr Utterson as to what this very unsavoury character of Mr Hyde, who's described as like a juggernaut. He's described with this sneering blackness. It's described as having some deformity about him, about his face, that people can't quite fully describe. And what this man has got to do with this friend of Mr Utterson's, Henry Jekyll, who we haven't yet met. It's also significant from the title of the chapter that it introduces us to the character of Hyde before we have met Dr. Jekyll. Now, of course, the whole book, the novel, is called Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. So we know that this is a significant character, this Mr Hyde. And there's also a slight sort of a pun with the idea of search and hide, the idea of hide and seek. So we get the sort of the double meaning of the name Hyde. It's not just his name, it's also the idea that he's hiding out somewhere. And we've got Mr Utterson, who becomes the person that's searching for Mr Hyde. So he's trying to find who this person is. Okay. So once again, the chapter's told in third person. So it's a third person narrator who's telling the story, but is following it predominantly from Mr Utterson's perspective. So as Mr Utterson finds out things, so too do we as the reader. That evening, Mr Utterson came home to his bachelor house in sombre spirits and sat down to dinner without relish. It was his custom of a Sunday, when his meal was over, to sit close by the fire, a volume of some dry divinity on his reading desk, until the clock of the neighbouring church rang out the hour of 12, when he would go soberly and gratefully to bed. So this is Mr Utterson, who's returned home. So he's had his Sunday afternoon walk, and it's worth noting the fact that Sunday would be classed very much as the Lord's Day. So as he said here, that he returned to his bachelor house in sombre spirits. Sombre means very serious. So obviously this is weighing on his mind quite significantly, the story that Mr Enfield has just told him. When it says about without relish, it doesn't mean without sort of burger relish. This is relish as in excitement. So he returned home in very dark mood, in very sombre mood, without any excitement, any relish. And it says that normally it was his custom to eat his Sunday meal and then to sit by the fire with a volume of some dry divinity. A volume just means a book, and dry divinity means something religious. So some really quite serious religious books. So that was normally what he would do on a Sunday after he'd eaten. And this will be quite typical of Victorian people to show that their links with God, and the fact that Sunday, being the Lord's Day, was a day when they would do no work, but they would observe their own religious education, their own religious understanding. But then it goes on to say that today, obviously, there's something different about this particular Sunday evening, because the story of this Mr. Hyde is weighing on him quite significantly. On this night, however, as soon as the cloth was taken away, the cloth just means his meal and the tablecloth. As soon as the cloth was taken away, he took up a candle and went into his business room. There he opened his safe, took from the most private part of it a document endorsed on the envelope as Dr. Jekyll's will, and sat down with a clouded brow to study its contents. Now, as a lawyer, he would be trusted with people's wills. If you're not sure what a will is a document that people write when they're alive, and it details who will benefit from them any money or any property that they might have. Okay, so the fact that Utterson is in possession of Dr. Jekyll's will shows that there's a real bond of trust between the two gentlemen, not just on a friendship point of view, but also on a sort of a legal and a professional point of view. Okay, so it seems that rather than sitting at his desk and reading some religious book, he's actually gone into his business room and taken out Dr. Jekyll's will. So there's obviously something that's troubling him about the will. The will was holograph, and Mr. Utterson, though he took charge of it now that it was made, had refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. It provided not only that in the case of the decease meaning death, the decease of Henry Jekyll, MD, DCL, LLD, FRS, etc., all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde, but that in the case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period exceeding 3 calendar months, the said Edward Hyde should step into the said Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay, and free from any burden or obligation beyond the payment of a few small sums to the members of the doctor's household. Now, that section there begins with Utterson's. We can clearly see that Utterson wasn't happy with the will when it was made at the time, because he says here that he refused to lend the least assistance in the making of it. Okay, which shows that even though he's in possession of the will now, he refused to help Dr. Jekyll in writing the will, and that's because at the time when it was written, he didn't agree with what Henry Jekyll actually said in the will. And the two things that Henry Jekyll said in the will were that if he were to die, so on the decease of Henry Jekyll, and it then lists, or the initials that are listed there are his medical qualifications. All right. So it reminds us as the reader, it tells us as the reader that Henry Jekyll is somebody that's quite a professional gentleman in the field of medicine. So the two statements of the will were that if Henry Jekyll were to die, all his possessions were to pass into the hands of his friend and benefactor, Edward Hyde. Or that if Henry Jekyll were to disappear or have an unexplained absence for any period longer than, so exceeding 3 months, Edward Hyde should step into Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay. Now, the reason why it seems that Utterson has gone straight into his business room rather than reading the Bible or any religious work is the fact that he has made the link between Henry Jekyll and Edward Hyde. Now, at the time that the will was written, Utterson had never met or had never heard of Mr. Hyde. Right, and given that Utterson and Jekyll are quite good friends, it would probably have been really quite confusing to Utterson as to who this Edward Hyde was and why Jekyll should pass all of his possessions, all of his property, his money, his entire estate into the hands of this person that Utterson has never heard of, despite being a close personal friend of Dr. Jekyll's. All right, so this is the first of the moments of kind of detective work that Utterson undertakes. Now, it's interesting that Enfield told him this story of the door because he didn't know of the contents of Jekyll's will. People's will is very confidential, right? And we know from what we've heard about Utterson that he's a very trustworthy man. So it's just sheer coincidence that Enfield told Utterson a story that involved this name of Edward Hyde, because this is the first time that Utterson has heard the name Hyde or had any connection to him other than the contents of Henry Jekyll's will. Okay. This document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended him both as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life, to whom the fanciful was the immodest. and hitherto it was his ignorance of Mr. Hyde that had swelled his indignation. But now, by a sudden turn, it was his knowledge. So what Stevenson is saying here, that this will that Utterson has been asked to keep in his safe by Henry Jekyll as something that's long been an eyesore to him. In other words, it's long been a source of concern or upset to him, because initially he didn't know who this Edward Hyde was, and he was would probably have been quite confused or quite concerned as to why he was the main recipient of the whole of Henry Jekyll's estate. All right, but as it says now, initially it was because he didn't know who Edward Hyde was, but now he's concerned because he has heard of Edward Hyde, and it's not in very good terms. It's in relation to, they think, maybe some kind of blackmailing of Dr. Jekyll. So this is where Utterson's starting point in the mystery is. He begins to assume that Edward Hyde is probably blackmailing Henry Jekyll, not just for the money that he took and gave to the girl's family in the form of the cheque in chapter 1, but now perhaps in terms of his entire estate, which would suggest that Henry Jekyll is being a blackmail for something really quite considerable. It was already bad enough when the name was but a name of which he could learn no more. It was worse when it began to be clothed upon with detestable attributes. Detestable means something terrible, and attributes means personality traits. So in other words, he's saying it was bad enough when he didn't know who this Edward Hyde was, but it's even worse now that he's starting to form a picture of him based on what he was told by Mr. Enfield. And out of the shifting insubstantial mists that had so long baffled his eye, there leaped up the sudden definite presentment of a fiend. A fiend is another word for a devil. So it seems that in Utterson's head, he's starting to have this belief that there's something quite devilish about this Edward Hyde, who is the sole beneficiary of Dr. Jekyll's will. I thought it was madness, he said to himself as he replaced the obnoxious paper in the safe, and now I begin to fear it is disgrace. Disgrace is a reference to perhaps some kind of bad behaviour that Dr. Jekyll has been involved with in his youth, and that he's been disgraced or blackmailed for it now by Mr. Hyde. With that, he blew out his candle, put on a greatcoat, and set forth in the direction of Cavendish Square, that citadel of medicine, where his friend, the great Dr. Lanyon, had his house, and received his crowding patients. If anyone knows, it will be Lanyon, he had thought. So we've got a reference to a new character here, and this is Dr. Lanyon. Now, Dr. Lanyon only appears in the novel 3 times, but all of them to do with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The fact that he's a doctor links him in terms of profession to Henry Jekyll, all right? So when he talks about Cavendish Square, the citadel of medicine, it suggests that Cavendish Square in London at the time was a place where lots of doctors lived. It was kind of a centre of medicine, in the same way that we perhaps talk about Harley Street these days. The solemn butler knew and welcomed him. So this is the butler at Dr. Lanyon's house. He was subjected to no stage of delay, but ushered direct from the door to the dining room, where Dr. Lanyon sat alone over his wine. This was a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman with a shock of hair prematurely white, and a boisterous and decided manner. Now, that description there of Dr. Lanyon is quite significant. It talks about him as being boisterous, hearty, healthy, red-faced, and a decided manner, which suggests that this is quite a larger-than-life kind of character. He's quite healthy, he seems quite a happy, quite a welcoming, friendly gentleman. That's significant because the final time that we hear of Dr. Lanyon, there is a hugely significant change in him. So make a note of that particular quote there about Dr. Lanyon, and notice that at the start of the book, when he's first introduced, Stevenson shows him as being a very upbeat, positive, healthy, happy sort of character. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, he sprang up from his chair and welcomed him with both hands. The geniality, that means friendliness, the geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. In other words, he's perhaps a little bit over the top, a little bit theatrical, a little bit dramatic in the way that he deals with people, which again is very different to Mr. Utterson and how we've seen him, because he's quite a sombre, serious gentleman. But as Stevenson says there, but it reposed on genuine feeling. In other words, even though he might be a little bit dramatic, a bit over the top in his dealings with people, Dr. Lanyon is actually very genuine in doing so. But these two were old friends, old mates both at school and college, both thorough respecters of themselves and of each other. and what does not always follow, men who thoroughly enjoyed each other's company. After a little rambling talk, the lawyer led up to the subject which so disagreeably preoccupied his mind. I suppose, Lanyon, he said, you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has. Now, the introduction between Utterson and Lanyon here suggests that these two have known each other for a very long time, through school and through college and throughout their own professional careers. So it shows that they have quite a lot of trust in each other. I wish the friends were younger, chuckled Dr. Lanyon, but I suppose we are. And what of it? I see very little of him now. Indeed, said Utterson, I thought you two had a bond of common interest. We had, was his reply, but it's more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind, and though of course I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man. Such unscientific balderdash, added the doctor, flushing suddenly purple, would have estranged Damon and Pythias. Now, Dr. Lanyon's response here to Mr. Utterson when he asks him about Dr. Jekyll is quite interesting, because he says that even though they have a bond of common interest, it's been 10 years since Henry Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon have seen each other. And Dr. Lanyon says that of Dr. Jekyll, that he began to go wrong in the mind. And it says that it talks of unscientific balderdash. Now, balderdash just means rubbish. So it suggests that the two of them have perhaps clashed over some aspect of science. But it's been 10 years since they've probably seen each other. And that's very, very important later on in the novel. So keep that in mind. The fact that even though Dr. Lanyon, Mr. Utterson, and Dr. Jekyll are all old friends and date back quite some time, Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll, haven't seen each other for quite some time, and it seems as though perhaps Henry Jekyll was involved in something that Dr. Lanyon perhaps didn't agree with, because even though they're both doctors, it seems that Dr. Lanyon is perhaps quite traditional in his views. And what that one comment there, where he refers to Dr. Jekyll as being involved in unscientific balderdash, it's an early but quite subtle indication to the reader that Dr. Jekyll has been dabbling in things scientifically or medically that perhaps are a little bit not futuristic, but certainly a little bit advanced in their thinking than Lanyon is able to deal with. This little spirit of terror was somewhat of a relief to Mr. Utterson. They've only differed on some point of science, he thought, and being a man of no scientific passions, except in the matter of conveyancing, he even added, it's nothing worse than that. He gave his friend a few seconds to recover his composure and then approached the question he had come to put. Now, we follow Utterson's thought pattern here, and in his mind, he realises that perhaps they, as he says here, they've only differed on some point of science. So it seems that perhaps even though Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll have perhaps fallen out over the past 10 years or so, Utterson puts it down to the fact that maybe it's just some difference of opinion in terms of science. And at that point, he dismisses his concerns, all right, before he comes to the main issue that he wanted to talk to Lanyon about. Did you ever come across a protege of his, one Hyde? He asked. Now, a protege is normally somebody younger than you that you perhaps train up in your field of excellence. So if, for example, you were a lawyer, a protege will perhaps be somebody young, somebody up and coming in the field that you perhaps train up and you teach them everything you know. And normally that person becomes somebody who is equally, if not more, successful in their career than you are. So a protege then is somebody younger that you kind of train up. So here, the question that Utterson asks of Lanyon is if he had ever come across this protege, so this young kind of friend of his, Mr. Hyde. Hyde, repeated Lanyon. No, never heard of him, since my time. That was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed, in which he tossed to and fro until the small hours of the morning began to grow large. It was a night of little ease to his toiling mind, toiling in mere darkness and besieged by questions. So Lanyon's response to whether or not he has ever heard of Mr. Hyde is that no, he's never heard of him, and it must have been since his time, so sometime since he's been friendly with Dr. Jekyll. And that's the end of the conversation, and then Utterson goes home and he has a very, very sleepless, very fretful night. Because it suggests that this whole incident is weighing very heavy on his mind. And the incident that's laying heavy on his mind is he wonders what it is that perhaps Edward Hyde has got over Jekyll. what it is that his friend is being blackmailed for by this quite unsavoury, unpleasant gentleman that he's heard of from Enfield. 6 o'clock struck on the bells of the church that was so conveniently near to Mr. Utterson's dwelling, and still he was digging at the problem. Hitherto it had touched him on the intellectual side alone, but now his imagination also was engaged, or rather enslaved. And as he lay and tossed in the gross darkness of the night in the curtained room, Mr. Enfield's tale went by before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. So even though it's 6 o'clock in the morning, it seems that perhaps he hasn't slept very well at all. So he's aware of the church bells that are near to his house, and it suggests that even though he's been thinking about it intellectually before, it seems that now he's starting to think about it emotionally, and he's starting to become concerned about his friend. And it talks about how Mr. Enfield's tale went before his mind in a scroll of lighted pictures. In other words, he can't get this picture, all these images out of his mind of the things that Enfield has told him. He will be aware of the great field of lamps of a nocturnal city. Nocturnal means nighttime. Then of a figure of a man walking swiftly. Then of a child running from the doctors. And then these met, and that human juggernaut trod the child down and passed on regardless of her screams. Or else he would see a room in a rich house where his friend lay asleep, dreaming and smiling in his dreams. And then the door of that room would be opened, the curtains of the bed plucked apart, the sleeper recalled, and lo, there would stand by his side a figure to whom power was given. And even at that dead hour he must rise and do its bidding. So all these things that Utterson is thinking about here, these are the images that are passing through his mind. So these aren't things that have actually happened. It's just that his mind is kind of replaying all these events. So whether they're dreams or whether they're just things that he's thinking over in his head, but either way, he keeps replaying the image in his head of what Enfield told him about this man running into this little girl. And then the second image that he has is of his friend, Dr. Jekyll in this case, lying asleep in bed, and somebody coming into the bedroom, opening up the curtains around his bed, and having some kind of blackmail issue over him. But either way, it seems that he can't stop the link in his mind between Dr. Jekyll, his friend, and this unpleasant gentleman that he's heard of, Mr. Hyde. And he keeps basically he's coming to the belief that Dr. Jekyll is being blackmailed by Edward Hyde, and this is what's concerning him. The figure in these two phases haunted the lawyer all night, and if at any time he dozed over, it was but to see it glide more stealthily through sleeping houses, or move more swiftly, and still the more swiftly, even to dizziness, through wider labyrinths of lamp-lighted city, and at every street corner crush a child and leave her screaming. And still the figure had no face by which he might know it. Even in his dreams it had no face, or one that baffled him and melted before his eyes. And thus it was that there sprang up and grew apace in the lawyer's mind a singularly strong, almost an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. So in his head then, over and over, he's replaying this image, but every time the figure of Mr. Hyde is almost without a face. Now, if you remember when Enfield talked about Mr. Hyde, he said that he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, some element of deformity that swamped his pictures of Edward Hyde. And this is what grows and grows the curiosity in Mr. Utterson's mind now too. And he wants, as he says here, it talks about an inordinate curiosity to behold the features of the real Mr. Hyde. In other words, a curiosity to look at the face of Mr. Hyde. So he wants to see him in the flesh. And if you notice, if you remember, the chapter is called The Search for Mr. Hyde. So this is what this image that keeps going round and round in Utterson's mind, and he has this desperation now to see him in order to satisfy his own curiosity. If he could but once set eyes on him, he thought the mystery would lighten and perhaps roll away altogether, as was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. He might see a reason for his friend's strange preference or bondage, call it what you please, and even for the startling clauses of the will. And at least it would be a face worth seeing, the face of a man who was without bowels of mercy, a face which had but to show itself to raise up in the mind of the unimpressionable Enfield a spirit of enduring hatred. So Utterson is kind of talking himself into reasons why he thinks he wants to see Edward Hyde, and he feels that perhaps if he does see him, it might calm his nerves a little bit, because very often things that are described to us by other people seem something quite terrifying in our mind, but when we see them ourselves in the flesh, they aren't that bad. So perhaps he says that perhaps he might see a reason why Dr. Jekyll is friends with this gentleman, why it is that he's left him the whole contents of his will when he dies. From that time forward, Mr. Utterson began to haunt the door in the by-street of shops. In the morning before office hours, at noon when business was plenty and time scarce, at night under the face of the fogged city moon, by all lights and at all hours of solitude or concourse, the lawyer was to be found on his chosen post. So it seems that Utterson has become quite obsessed now, because it's saying that first thing in the morning, during office hours, at noon, at night time, he keeps going around by the door where Enfield told him that Hyde came and went with the. If he be Mr. Hyde, he thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. And at last his patience was rewarded. It was a fine dry night, frost in the air, streets as clean as a ballroom floor, the lamps unshaken by any wind drawing a regular pattern of light and shadow. By 10 o'clock, when the shops were closed, the by-street was very solitary, and in spite of the low growl of London from all round, very silent. Small sounds carried far. Domestic sounds out of the houses were clearly audible on either side of the roadway, and the rumour of the approach of any passenger preceded him by a long time. So, as it says here, it's about 10 o'clock one night. It's a fine, dry night, and it's so quiet around these parts that any footsteps can be heard very clearly. Mr. Utterson had been some minutes at his post when he was aware of an odd, light footstep drawing near. In the course of his nightly patrols, he had long grown accustomed to the quaint effect with which the footfalls of a single person, while he is still a great way off, suddenly spring out distinct from the vast hum and clatter of the city. Yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested, and it was with a strong superstitious prevision of success that he withdrew into the entry of the court. So it's saying here that Mr. Utterson has been doing this for quite some time, for quite some nights or weeks or perhaps, and he's become quite used to the way that perhaps people's footsteps become suddenly within his earshot. But as he says here, that there's this one set of footprints, this one time that somehow grabs his attention. And as it says here, yet his attention had never before been so sharply and decisively arrested. So he believes here that there's something so unusual about these footsteps that he thinks that this must be the person that he's looking for, Edward Hyde. The steps drew swiftly nearer and swelled out suddenly louder as they turned the end of the street. The lawyer, looking forth from the entry, could soon see what manner of man he had to deal with. Now, these descriptions here are in fact of Edward Hyde. He's correct in believing that it is him. So notice here the language that's used by Stevenson to describe Edward Hyde. So this is kind of our first introduction to Edward Hyde as a reader. He was small and very plainly dressed, and the look of him, even at that distance, went somehow strongly against the watcher's inclination. So it's suggesting that even at this distance, there is something that goes against the watcher's eye. It's something that perhaps turns him against this gentleman, even at this distance. But he made straight for the door, crossing the roadway to save time. And as he came, he drew a key from his pocket, like one approaching home. Mr. Utterson stepped out and touched him on the shoulder as he passed. Mr. Hyde, I think. Now, the fact that it says that Edward Hyde takes a key from his pocket like one approaching home suggests that he's quite familiar with going to and from this house with a key, which would be quite unusual for somebody to actually have a key to a house that wasn't theirs and to be quite so at home there and feel quite so casual in the way that they went to and from. Mr. Hyde, I think. Mr. Hyde shrank back with a hissing intake of breath, but his fear was only momentary, and though he did not look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly enough, "That is my name. What do you want?" Notice there the description where it talks about hissing intake of breath. Quite a number of the descriptions of Edward Hyde are quite animalistic, and there's almost something quite serpent-like here with the hissing intake of breath. And it seems that, first of all, this gentleman's reaction is one of fear, but it was only momentary. And then, although he didn't look the lawyer in the face, he answered coolly. So he's quite calm. Now, bear in mind that we find out later on that Jekyll and Hyde are one and the same person. So he actually does quite a good job here of disguising the fact that he knows exactly who Utterson is, because, of course, this Edward Hyde will have met Mr. Utterson many, many times under his disguise of Dr. Jekyll. "I see you are going in," returned the lawyer. "I'm an old friend of Dr. Jekyll's, Mr. Utterson of Gaunt Street. You must have heard my name. And meeting you so conveniently, I thought you might admit me. Admit me means admit me into the house. You will not find Dr. Jekyll. He is away from home, replied Mr. Hyde, blowing on the key. And then suddenly, but still without looking up, how did you know me? He asked. So we can see here that perhaps in his mind, Mr. Hyde is quite curious as to how Utterson knows who he is, because of course he knows that he's never met him before. On your side, said Mr. Utterson, will you do me a favour? With pleasure, replied the other. What shall it be? Will you let me see your face? Asked the lawyer. Now, he asked this question because, of course, this is the one thing that has been almost kind of haunting his dreams and his thoughts, because Enfield himself said that he wasn't able to describe Mr. Hyde's face. So Utterson here is asking to see his face so that he knows what he looks on the next time he sees him, so he can almost satisfy his own curiosity. Will you let me see your face? Asked the lawyer. Mr. Hyde appeared to hesitate, and then, as if upon some sudden reflection, fronted about with an air of defiance, and the pair stared at each other pretty fixedly for a few seconds. Now I shall know you again, said Utterson. It may be useful. Now, this is interesting because right from the first time that we see Mr. Hyde, there are almost two sides of the personality. On one strange side, he's quite fearful, he's quite shy, quite reluctant, quite fearful. Yet on the other, he's shown to be quite defiant and quite arrogant and quite determined. Okay, and as the more that we learn about Hyde later on, the more that we realise that he is obviously trying to hide from people because he doesn't want them to see who he is. Yes, returned Mr. Hyde. It is as well we have met, and apropos you should have my address. And he gave a number of a street in Soho. Good God, thought Mr. Utterson, can he too have been thinking of the will? But he kept his feelings to himself and only grunted in acknowledgement of the address. So the first thing that Mr. Hyde really says to Utterson when he's shown him his face is he gives Utterson his address, and Utterson's first thought is that he knows what's in the will. So he is concerned now, even more so for Dr. Jekyll, because he believes that perhaps Hyde has got, perhaps might do something violent, perhaps towards Dr. Jekyll to get the contents of the will. And that's the first thing that Utterson believes, is that Hyde has given him his address so that when anything happens to Dr. Jekyll, he will know where to find him to give him the money and the contents of the will. And now, said the other, how do you know me? By description, was the reply from Utterson. Whose description? We have common friends, said Mr. Utterson. Common friends, echoed Mr. Hyde a little hoarsely. Who are they? Jekyll, for instance, said the lawyer. He never told you, cried lawyer with a flush of anger. I did not think you would have lied. Now, the mistake that Utterson makes here without realising is that he claims to Mr. Hyde that he's been told about him by Dr. Jekyll. But of course, given that Hyde and Jekyll are the same person, Hyde knows for an absolute fact that Jekyll has not told Mr. Utterson about him. And his first comments to him were, I did not think that you would have lied. Come, said Mr. Utterson, that is not fitting language. The fitting language here is about calling somebody a liar, not a lawyer, because going back to this idea of a Victorian gentleman, it would be very, very wrong of people to lie or to accuse somebody of being a liar if you were a Victorian gentleman of a middle class. The other snarled aloud into a savage laugh, and the next moment, with extraordinary quickness, he'd unlocked the door and disappeared into the house. Look at the language again there, where it talks about snarled and a savage laugh. So he disappears very quickly. The lawyer stood a while when Mr. Hyde had left him, the picture of disquietude. Disquietude means unhappiness and concern. Then he began slowly to mount the street, pausing every step or two and putting his hand to his brow like a man in mental perplexity. So it seems that even though Mr. Utterson has finally got to see Mr. Hyde, it seems that it hasn't calmed his anxiety, and actually he's more perplexed or more confused now than ever. The problem he was thus debating as he walked was one of a class that is rarely solved. Mr. Hyde was pale and dwarfish. Note that quote. He gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. He had a displeasing smile. He'd borne himself to the lawyer with a sort of murderous mixture of timidity and boldness, and he spoke with a husky, whispering and somewhat broken voice. All these were points against him. But not all of these together could explain the hitherto unknown disgust, loathing and fear with which Mr. Utterson regarded him. Now, they're really quite important quotes there. The fact that he's small and dwarfish, that's significant because later on we discover that Edward Hyde is created from the 1/10 of evil that hides within Jekyll's personality. And the idea here that Stevenson is putting over is the fact that he's small and not very well formed, because the evil side, the 10% of Dr. Jekyll at this point in the events, isn't very well developed because he hasn't shown himself as Hyde very often. So he's small and dwarfed at this particular point. And it talks about that he gave an impression of deformity without any nameable malformation. In other words, there's an air of wrongness about him, but nothing specific that you can actually put your finger on and say that that's what it is. And that's because we later find out, as I've said, that Edward Hyde is the first human being that's ever composed entirely of evil without any form of good within him. Um, and as I was saying earlier in the chapter, where it talks about there's two strange sides to Mr. Hyde. One part he's quite shy and reluctant, but in other words he's quite bold. It's summed up beautifully in the quote where it says about he had a murderous mixture of timidity and boldness. Timidity means shyness if you're quite timid. So there's this strange mix of quite shy and reluctant in some ways, but also quite bold and arrogant in others. But either way, Mr. Utterson can't account for the fact that he feels such unknown disgust, loathing, and fear towards Mr. Hyde, but he can't explain why. There must be something else, said the perplexed gentleman. There is something more, if I could find a name for it. God bless me, the man seems hardly human. Something troglodytic, shall we say? Or can it be the old story of Dr. Fell? Or is it the mere radiance of a foul soul that thus transpires through and transfigures its clay continent? The last, I think, for oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll! If ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on it is on that of your new friend. Now, Utterson's thoughts here are quite interesting because he refers to him as something troglodytic. Now, a troglodyte is the name for early man, early cave dwellers. And this goes back to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that mankind actually developed from early humans who themselves developed from the apes, who in turn developed from other smaller life forms millions and millions of years ago. And it's suggesting that that perhaps Mr. Hyde is something evil because he's somebody that's evolved from apes rather than being made in God's image. And the other thing that Utterson thinks about is the fact that his soul, it talks about the radiance of a foul soul that transpires through its clay continent. Its clay continent is your face or the external part of you. And he's wondering whether this man is so foul in his soul, so black in his soul, Edward Hyde, that it comes through on his face. And this is what Utterson believes, because he says, if ever I read Satan's signature on a face, it's in that of your new friend. Now, he refers to Henry Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll, as Harry Jekyll. Now, strangely, Harry is actually a nickname for people called Henry. So, for example, Prince Harry, as we know from our own royal family, his actual real name is Henry, not Harry. So when he talks about Harry Jekyll, it shows that they're very good friends because that's his sort of nickname. In the same way that we might call people who were Jacob, perhaps called Jake, they have their name shortened. Round the corner from the by street there was a square of ancient handsome houses, now for the most part decayed from their high estate, and letting flats and chambers to all sorts of conditions of men, map engravers, architects, shady lawyers, and the agents of obscure enterprises. One house, however, second from the corner, was still occupied entire, and at the door of this, which wore a great air of wealth and comfort, though it was now plunged in darkness except for the fanlight, Mr. Utterson stopped and knocked. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. So when when Mr. Hyde leaves him suddenly, and Mr. Utterson goes off in a state of confusion and perplexity, he goes round the corner from the by street into a big square. Now, London has lots of big sort of squares, if you've ever been there. There's often very big grand houses that date back to perhaps to the Georgian times, would have a square in the middle that would be a private garden for people that lived around. And as it says here, he goes around the corner of the by street, goes into one of these ancient squares, but a lot of the houses now are kind of carved up into smaller apartments and flats and are owned by different business people. But there's one house, second from the corner, that was still occupied entirely. Now, the house that he goes to is actually the house of Dr. Jekyll. Okay, so it seems that after he's met Hyde, he feels compelled to go and try and speak to Dr. Jekyll. A well-dressed elderly servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll at home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see Mr. Utterson," said Poole, admitting the visitor as he spoke into a large, low-roofed, comfortable hall, paved with flags, just means flagstone, so it's a stone floored hallway, warmed after the fashion of a country house by a bright open fire and furnished with costly cabinets of oak. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" Now, the description of the house here was quite significant because if you think about chapter 1, where we heard about the story of the doorway is described in very negative terms. And we find out that actually that was the back entrance into Dr. Jekyll's house. The front entrance, though, if you notice, is described in very, very different terms. It's described as being quite welcoming. It's described as having a fire. Now, a fire in Victorian literature is always a symbol of welcome. It's always a symbol of light and hope and warmth. And what Stevenson is very subtly doing here is he's describing the two entrances into the house as being very opposing in this opposite, with the very negative back door, the small secretive back door that Hyde comes and goes. It's describing it in very opposite terms with the front of the house, which is where Dr. Jekyll comes and goes. And that the house then is being used as a metaphor for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because it's the idea that we have these two very opposing sides. The welcoming front part that people know of Dr. Jekyll, and then the secretive back part of Mr. Hyde, where which is associated with evil and darkness and negativity. So look out for that description. "Will you wait here by the fire, sir, or shall I give you a light in the dining room?" "Here, thank you," said the lawyer, and he drew near and leaned on the tall fender. The fender is just the mantelpiece of the fire. This hall in which he was now left alone was a pet fancy of his friend the doctor's, and Utterson himself was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. Now, this is another reference, as I was just saying, this very positive front part access to the house, which we associate with Dr. Jekyll. But tonight there was a shudder in his blood. The face of Hyde sat heavy on his memory, and he felt, what was rare with him, a nausea and distaste of life. And in the gloom of his spirits, he seemed to read a menace in the flickering of the firelight on the polished cabinets and the uneasy starting of the shadow on the roof. So it seems that even though he normally associates Dr. Jekyll's house with positivity and warmth and welcome, because he has still got the memory of Mr. Hyde on his mind, he now starts to see it in quite a different way. He was ashamed of his relief when Poole presently returned to announce that Dr. Jekyll had gone out. Now, Poole is the butler to Dr. Jekyll. Now, a butler is a little bit more than a normal servant. He will be the highest, most official person in the household of wealthy people. Your butler was much more than just somebody that fetched and carried for you. Your butler would probably be the equivalent today would probably be a PA, a personal assistant. They would know everything about your life, and they would be very, very discreet. They'd be very highly trained, and they will be very, very highly regarded and trusted in the household. So Paul becomes a significant character later on, especially in his dealings with Mr. Utterson and the concerns that he has over Dr. Jekyll. "I saw Mr. Hyde going by the old dissecting room door, Poole," he said. "Is that right, when Dr. Jekyll is from home?" "Quite right, Mr. Utterson, sir," replied the servant. "Mr. Hyde has a key." So at this point, Utterson is questioning Poole as to whether or not it's right that Henry Jekyll has clearly given Edward Hyde a key to the back door to the old dissecting rooms. Now, the back part of the house, which talks about the old dissecting rooms, the house was previously owned by a doctor of anatomy and of biology. So perhaps a doctor that would work in hospitals. And what often would happen was these wealthy doctors would have a part of their house where they would do their teaching, where they would tutor young upcoming doctors and surgeons, right? So in the same way that perhaps people would go to university or medical school, young doctors would be trained up by more experienced doctors. So the previous doctor that owned the house before Dr. Jekyll had these old dissecting rooms where he would do, they would probably do autopsies on dead bodies for the purposes of their young students that they would be training up. Okay, so the old dissecting room door would be the place that they would come and go, rather than the young doctors, the trainee doctors, coming through the front part of the house. "Your master seems to repose a great deal of trust in that young man, Poole," resumed the other musingly. "Yes, sir, he do indeed," said Poole. "We have all orders to obey him." "I do not think I ever met Mr. Hyde?" asked Utterson. "Oh dear, no, sir. He never dines here," replied the butler. "Indeed, we see very little of him on this side of the house. He mostly comes and goes by the laboratory door." "Well, good night, Paul." "Good night, Mr. Utterson." And this would be adding, of course, to Mr. Utterson's confusion here, because this is somebody that wouldn't dine regularly with the doctor, and certainly not with sort of groups of friends at dinner parties. And it adds to Utterson's confusion, because he'd be wondering what it is, what the reason is why Mr. Hyde is the sole benefactor of Dr. Jekyll's will. And the lawyer set out homeward with a very heavy heart. "Poor Harry Jekyll," he thought, "my mind misgives me. He's in deep waters." Deep waters means in a difficult situation, in perhaps a situation he can't get out of. He was wild when he was young, a long while ago to be sure, but in the law of God there is no statute of limitations. So Utterson here is acknowledging the fact that Henry Jekyll was perhaps a little bit wild in his youth, even though it was some time ago. But this idea of the statute of limitations suggests that there is no time limit on blackmail, and this is what he keeps coming back to. Ah, it must be that, the ghost of some old sin, the cancer of some concealed disgrace, punishment coming pediclordo, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault. And this is just a reference to blackmail, so he believes that perhaps Dr. Jekyll did something in his past that has come back to haunt him now in the form of Edward Hyde finding out about it and blackmailing him. And the lawyer, scared by the thought, brooded a while on his own past, groping in all the corners of his memory, lest by chance some jack-in-the-box of an old iniquity should leap to light there. So it causes Utterson to delve back into his own memory of his own past and wondering if he's done something bad enough to be perhaps blackmailed in his current self, in the same way that he believes that Dr. Jekyll is being blackmailed by Edward Hyde. His own past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension. Yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. So in his own past, he sort of thinks that he perhaps hasn't done anything that's particularly evil or wicked in his own past, and yet he becomes quite grateful of the things that he might have very nearly done but didn't do so in his youth. And then by return on his former subject, he conceived a spark of hope. This Master Hyde, if he was studied, thought he, must have secrets of his own, black secrets by the look of him, secrets compared to which poor Jekyll's worst would be like sunshine. So Utterson's next thought, when he's walking back to his own house, is perhaps that this Hyde seems such a black and unpleasant, dark man that he must have his own dark secrets. So Utterson starts to become a little bit obsessed with Edward Hyde, perhaps trying to find something on him as well that he can perhaps then use to counteract the blackmail that Edward Hyde he believes has over Dr. Jekyll. Things cannot continue as they are. It turns me cold to think of this creature stealing like a thief to Harry's bedside. Poor Harry, what awakening, and the danger of it! For if this Hyde suspect the existence of the will, he may grow impatient to inherit. So Utterson's main fear is that Mr. Hyde knows the contents of Henry Jekyll's will, and he starts to fear that if he does, he might speed up Jekyll's death in order to get hold of the contents of the will, to get hold of Henry Jekyll's possessions and house and money. I must put my shoulder to the wheel, if Jekyll will but let me, he added, if Jekyll will only let me. For once more he saw before his mind's eye, as clear as transparency, the strange causes of the will. So at the end of the chapter there, then he decides that he perhaps will help out Henry Jekyll and try and find something that they can use against Hyde. And his end thoughts are there, if Jekyll will only let me. But then he begins to worry about the contents of the will once again. So he's perhaps very concerned at this point that Henry Jekyll might not let him help him to find things against Hyde, because perhaps the whatever crime it is or whatever wrongdoing it was that Jekyll committed in his youth is so dark that he doesn't want people to know. Okay, because as we've talked before in chapter about this idea of the Victorian gentleman. One of the key traits of him would be his reputation, and keeping his reputation of a very high standard. Otherwise, people wouldn't want anything to do with him. So perhaps he's fearful that Henry Jekyll won't allow Utterson to help him because he doesn't want him to know, Utterson himself, to know whatever it is that Hyde might have over him. So at the end of the chapter there, we see Utterson becoming quite significantly involved. And as I've said previously, he becomes the detective for the reader. He's the one that pieces together everything. Now, it's quite interesting to note that in this chapter, he admits to us as the reader that he holds Dr. Jekyll's will inside an envelope in his safe. Now, that safe becomes quite a significant thing in the book because various people, including Dr. Lanyon and later, once again, Dr. Jekyll, ask Utterson to keep things in the will as secret enclosements. And if only Utterson were to open all of the contents of his safe, he would have the whole story incomplete. But because he's so trustworthy and honourable, he doesn't do that. And it means that he has to have the story pieced together bit by bit as various things are revealed to him. Okay, so hopefully that's helped you with chapter